Thompson's House by Anonymous, published in the Cardiff Evening Express on the 16th of November 1901. Read by Bethina. One very hot summer, Thompson, my old school friend, offered to lend me his house for a month. Circumstances, more plainly my means, would not allow me to go abroad. I dislike the seaside and never go there for pleasure, so I gladly accepted his offer, and leaving my hot and dusty rooms and office to my landlady's mercy, I went down to the old cathedral town for a month of country air. Thompson's house stands in the close, at some little distance from the dwellings inhabited by canons and dean, in those sedate precincts. It is very old, and was evidently built as one large house, but for many years it has been divided. Thompson lets the other half. His own part has the larger half of a beautiful old-fashioned garden at the back, and on the first day after my arrival I did nothing, I fear, but wander up and down the shady lawn and give myself up to the pleasure of having absolutely nothing which must be done in that day. But the next morning after breakfast I started on a long expedition in search of interesting church architecture, in which I know the neighbourhood was rich, and about which I am an enthusiast, naturally perhaps, as I am an architect. But mine is not only professional interest. In any case, I must have felt the charm of the old records of the past, contained in early English decorated and perpendicular arches and pillars, for those to whom the words are more than names. On my return that evening, I found Thompson's good housekeeper, he is not married, rather anxious at my late hours, and excited at the arrival of new tenants next door. They had been expected apparently for some days, and Mrs. Morse was most anxious that they should prove as quiet and inoffensive as the last tenant, a deaf and paralytic old lady, who never annoyed master nor me in the least, and she was there before I came, 14 years ago, last May, that is. All this, and much more of her fears and anxieties, lest the new neighbours should give noisy parties and keep late hours, as they did next door when I lived last, which was why I left, sir, for their noise was dreadful. Mrs. Morse told me, as she held in her hand the toast which she had brought in for my tea, and which, in her abstraction, she forgot to set down. Not until she had at last shut the door after her good-natured gossip, and I had found the toast decidedly cold, did I remember that I had heard a piano the night before, as I sat and smoked, apparently played next door. I accounted for it by imagining that someone must have arrived there sooner than Mrs. Morse knew. She told me the next morning that the new neighbours were only a young lady and her aunt, and on hearing this I most successfully calmed her fears of the night before. During the next week I spent most of my days in sketching an early English church near, which I had discovered with great pleasure, and in the evenings smoked many a pipe while listening to the piano next door. Generally I am unreasonably irritated when I am obliged to listen to other people's pianos against my will. There is something very trying in being obliged to submit without remonstrance to hear whatever they may be moved to play, or worse still, practice. But this was different. It was, I thought, a woman's touch, and she played well, chiefly old airs and sonatas of Corelli. I am very fond of the old musicians, and there was in this playing of them something very gentle and soothing. One evening at the end of that week I found, on coming in, a note which I opened and read in great surprise. Miss Ethel Mayne would be very greatly obliged if Mr. Wyndham would not allow his piano to be used at so late an hour. Miss Mayne asks this for the sake of her aunt, an invalid, who is greatly disturbed by it. I read this note over and over again, each time with more amazement. How could I explain, without seeming rude and brusque, that I not only had never played during my stay here, but that the house did not even contain a piano? Thompson is not in the least musical. The more I thought of it, the stranger it appeared. One thing was certain. The piano which disturbed them must be the same as that to which I had listened on so many evenings. At last I decided to call next morning and explain better than a note could that I was not to blame. I did so about 12 o'clock next day, and was shown into a drawing-room, wearing the uncomfortable look common to newly arranged rooms before they have had time to receive any marks of the owner's characteristics. In a few moments the door opened, and a tall girl with dark hair and a sweet face came in. She bowed as I rose, and said, "Mr. Wyndham, I imagine you have called in answer to my note. I am sure you will accede to my request. My aunt is now only recovering from a long illness, and the piano keeps her awake at night." "I would, of course, instantly discontinue it," I said, "if it were in my power, but I came to explain that I have played nothing since my coming here. Indeed, my friend has no piano, in fact. Miss Mayne, I thought that I was listening to your playing every night, for I have heard what must be the same piano." Miss Mayne looked incredulous at first, then utterly amazed. "I do not understand," she said. "Can it be that we are near enough to hear this from any other house?" She rose and went to the window. "No, it is impossible," as the window, from which we could see some distance, showed the nearest house to be separated from us by the garden and a street that ran at the bottom of it, beside the whole length of another garden and rambling old orchard. "Is it possible," I said, feeling as if I saw a glimmer of light on the question, "that any of your household walk in their sleep? We hear this quite late, and it might be possible people have done such strange things in sleep." "Indeed, no," she said. "I am afraid that it will not do as an explanation. We have just now only one old servant, whom I have known all my life, and I never knew of her doing such a thing. Besides, she is not musical," smiling as she said it. "I can answer for my aunt and myself, and, for full assurance, our piano is not yet unlocked. I have the key," touching her watch-chain. "I have been too occupied with my aunt to touch it as yet." "It is more than I can understand," said I, rising. "It must be accounted for by some kind of echo. I will write to my friend Thompson about it. I am only staying in his house for a week or two, as you may know. I called because I wished you to understand how gladly I would put a stop to what annoys you, were I able." She gave me her hand on leaving, and I thought hers one of those faces which seem more beautiful as you know them better. I wrote to Thompson, and got in a day or two the following characteristic note: "Dear Wyndham, you must have been asleep. People next door too. Never heard any piano, and I have lived here 14 years. The man who was there before me is dead, so can't send you to him for information. Glad I don't hear it. Can't bear music. Delighted that you like the country. Yours, F.T." I called at the end of the week to tell Miss Mayne the result of my letter. The aunt was better and downstairs. They gave me afternoon tea, and I came away thinking that the mystery, as it still was, had at least obtained for me 2 very pleasant acquaintances. But the unexplained music did not pass from my mind, especially as I heard it still, though not every evening. I am a believer in what are loosely called ghosts, and one day when Mrs. Morse was in a very talkative mood as she took away my tea, I brought her conversation round to the subject of haunted houses, hoping that if there were any tradition belonging to Thompson's house she would mention it. After many stories, which she took pains to say she should not think it believing, she said, "This looks a likely house for such stories, but I have never heard, nor looked to hear or see anything. But some people are so silly. There was a silly girl we had here, a housemaid, always fancying she heard music at night near her room. She slept downstairs, and at last she left through it, though I couldn't tell master such a tale, but had to tell him something more sensible. Such nonsense! I used to tell her she dreamt of what her head was full of, for she was all for music, wonderfully fond of it. Why couldn't she mind her work and sleep at night without dreams, as honest people should?" With this last moral sentiment, Mrs. Morse and the tea-things clattered away together. What she had said was odd, I thought. Certainly I was more than half inclined to account for that piano as something supernatural, but I could not call next door and say so. It would seem ridiculous, and I should certainly run the risk of being laughed at. A few days later my holiday came to an end, and I left the lovely country with very pleasant memories of Thompson's old and, as I began to believe, haunted house. It did not pass away from my memory during the busy winter days. Neither did the sweet face of Miss Ethel Main. Years have gone since then. Some success as an architect has come to me, and I am married. Last year, by one of those strange chances which come in some men's lives, Thompson had a very large estate left him in the north of France. He went over to make arrangements of selling it, but liked the situation so much that he has settled there, and I have bought his old house. I have thrown both houses into one and made several changes since the days when I first knew it. Amongst others, we use as a drawing room the large room at the back overlooking the garden, which Thompson used as a lumber room, I think. My wife and I hope to spend many summer months there. Our stay this year had nearly come to an end when on one Sunday evening I stayed up very late smoking. Before I went upstairs I remembered that my wife wanted a book brought up, and I went into the drawing room to fetch it. There was no light in the room but the red glow of the fire we had enjoyed that chilly evening, and I was bending over the table to try and find the book when a slight movement made me look up, and standing close by the piano I saw, I am very sure of it, a slight girlish figure with a face I shall never forget. It was so terribly sad. Slowly she moved from where she stood and seemed to pass me. She wore some sort of clinging brown dress. I followed into the hall, where I seemed to see her go. No one was there. I roused my wife, and together we searched the house. Vainly, of course. I was not the least alarmed at the time, beyond a slight shock on finding myself not alone as I had imagined. But afterwards, for months, waking and sleeping, that face, with its terrible grief, has been before me. Of course, I tried in every way I could to find out what story could be connected with the house, without, however, saying why I wished to know, for I felt almost as if I should be betraying her confidence if I made that sad face a matter of everyday gossip at afternoon teas and dinner parties. We are in London again for the winter now, and one day lately I met an old lady who had, in her girlhood, well known the town in which I spent the summer. She told me that many years before my house had had the reputation of being haunted, but that the rumour had been hushed by the landlord and forgotten. And she told me this story. The house was once occupied by a young husband and wife. They loved each other devotedly, but the husband was unreasonably jealous of his brother. One evening he accused his wife of deceiving him as to her love. She was too wounded to answer his bitter words, and he went out. 2 hours later he had drowned himself, and his dead body was brought into the house, into the very room where his young wife was playing while waiting for his return. She lost her senses from that day, and during the rest of her mercifully short life her music was her only apparent consolation. And, added the old lady, she is said to play there still. Those who love music can sometimes hear her. For myself, the thought of the poor girl's bitterly sad story will only give me an added interest to the face I shall never forget, and her music both my wife and I have listened to and loved for long, for my wife heard it first, when she was Ethel Main. I hope you enjoyed this obscure and anonymous ghost story. If so, please remember to hit the like button, and if you haven't already, consider subscribing to the channel. I have more ghost stories. If you look at my channel, there's a playlist called Audiobooks, and you'll find more there. And as always, thank you for listening.